3 hours before my Medal of Valor ceremony at Camp Pendleton, I found something that did not belong beneath my seat. At first, it felt like nothing more than a tiny interruption in an otherwise carefully managed afternoon, a faint tug inside my mind as I walked through the preparation hall where the Marine Corps had arranged rows of polished folding chairs for families and VIP guests. The October air drifting through the open side doors carried the smell of the Pacific sharp and cool, the kind of air that usually steadied my breathing before any official event. I should have been calm. I should have been proud. Instead, the instincts I had spent 11 years sharpening as an EOD officer started vibrating beneath my ribs the moment I stepped into that room. The clock on the wall read 15:20. The ceremony would begin at 1800. Marines moved in steady patterns around me, checking microphones, adjusting flags, placing bottles of water behind the podium. My dress blues fit perfectly the weight of the ribbons familiar against my chest. Yet none of it eased the rigid feeling rising from my spine. I told myself I was being cautious, not anxious. Habit, not nerves. But when I reached my assigned seat and crouched down to tuck my cover beneath it, my fingertips brushed a small object that should not have been there at all. A smooth metal edge. A piece of wiring where no wiring should be. A faint click when pressure shifted. In that instant, my throat tightened. I froze completely, every cell locking into the same stillness I had once carried in Afghanistan whenever something on the ground looked just slightly too clean or too perfectly placed. I leaned closer without touching it again and whispered a quiet breath to steady myself. Improvised, not standard issue, not military grade. The placement was careless in some ways and deliberate in others, the kind of thing built by someone who knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to understand what could happen if it shifted wrong. I stepped back slowly and signaled the nearest Marine. When the EOD team arrived and inspected the object, the lead tech lowered his voice and glanced around before speaking. "Ma'am, this device is not random. Someone placed it intentionally under Captain Maddox's seat." The words sank into me like cold water. I felt the room tilt even though I stood perfectly still. My mind began replaying the last few hours and every person who had come near that row of chairs. Only one image rose immediately and sharply. My sister, Amber Maddox, 29 years old. She had walked into the preparation area earlier claiming she wanted to put a small gift on my seat so she could record my reaction later. At the time, I thought her sudden sweetness was suspicious, but I let it slide because it was easier than arguing. Now the memory of her smile made my stomach tighten. The EOD techs worked quietly, isolating the device, preparing to remove it. I could hear radios murmuring outside the hall. Footsteps multiplied. The atmosphere shifted from ceremonial calm to controlled alarm. My parents stood a few yards away watching the commotion gather around my chair, and instead of fear, I heard irritation in my mother's voice. "Riley, you always overreact. It's probably a prop or some kind of misunderstanding." My father crossed his arms and muttered something about people being too sensitive these days. They did not step closer. They did not ask if I was all right. They did not even acknowledge the EOD badge on the men's chests or the urgency in their movements. Instead, they acted as if I had purposely created an inconvenience on their big day, as if the ceremony celebrating their daughter was actually an event meant to highlight them. The youngest Marine standing nearby looked at my parents as if he could not believe what he was hearing. Then he turned to me and said quietly under his breath, "Ma'am, this could have harmed you instantly." Hearing that from someone so new to the Corps made the truth crash into me harder than the discovery itself. My pulse hammered, my vision sharpened. The hall that had been filled moments earlier with harmless anticipation now felt charged with betrayal. My family did not understand the danger. Worse, they did not care. I watched the techs carry the device out in a secure container, and for a moment the entire building seemed to fall into a thick silence. I felt something inside me shift, a final line breaking, a final illusion dissolving. I had spent my whole life being told I was dramatic oversensitive, reading too much into things. Yet here I was, standing above a device that should never have been within a mile of a Marine Corps installation, and still, my parents acted as if I were the problem. My shock slid into numbness. then into a cold quiet that felt steadier than any calm I had known. They did not care that I had almost been harmed. They cared that I was interrupting their evening. Where are you watching from, and has anyone ever called you dramatic while you were fighting to stay safe? I was 33 years old, 11 years into my service as a Marine Corps EOD officer, but if you asked my family back in Boise what I did for a living, they would shrug and say something like, "She is playing soldier again." They never said it with curiosity or affection. It was always said with that dry, dismissive tone people use when they talk about someone who has wasted their life. Most people assume the hardest part of my job is kneeling in front of a device that could end everything in the span of a breath. But the truth is that after all these years in uniform, after Afghanistan and Syria and Somalia, the hardest thing I have ever faced has been walking through the front door of the Maddox house. Camp Pendleton was home in a way Idaho never managed to be. The base had its own rhythm, its own air. The sound of distant artillery training, the hum of aircraft moving along the coast, the cadence of Marines running in formation before dawn. Every corner of that place carried history and purpose. It grounded me. It made sense. I learned early in my career that the work chose me in a way I could not fully explain. The first time I stood in front of an actual device, sand pressing against my boots, sweat sliding between my shoulder blades as I studied wires half hidden under rubble, something inside me clicked into alignment. Most people tremble when they face that kind of threat. My hands stilled. My breathing leveled. It felt like doing exactly what I had been built for. I wish my family could have seen that version of me, the one shaped by deployments and danger and responsibility, but they never wanted to. In their minds, I had chosen a life meant for someone sturdier, someone who fit their idea of strength. They never saw strength as quiet focus. They saw it as physical size or the ability to dominate a room the way my father did. Mark Maddox had been emotionally controlling for as long as I could remember. He did not raise his voice often, but he did not need to. He had a way of narrowing his eyes that made you feel small before he even spoke. When I told him at 22 that I was enlisting, he stared at me for a long time and finally said, "You barely know how to change a tire. How do you expect to handle explosives?" He meant it as an insult, but it became one of the reasons I trained twice as hard as everyone else. My mother, Diane, never disagreed with him. She preferred softer forms of sabotage. She would say things like, "We just want you safe," or "Maybe you should think about doing something more appropriate for a woman." She called it concern. It was really gaslighting wrapped in polite language. She loved to remind me that I had always been dramatic. That word followed me through my childhood like a shadow I never asked for. My sister Amber perfected it into an art. She would roll her eyes when I mentioned anything about my work. She once laughed while telling her friends that I diffused things because I could not handle real life. At 29, she still thrived on creating scenes that made her look fragile and made everyone else look cruel. She knew exactly how to manipulate our parents, how to tug on their sympathy like pulling a marionette string. It never mattered what I accomplished. Amber would always be the delicate one they needed to protect, and I would always be the dramatic one they needed to manage. In the Marines, though, no one saw me that way. On deployment, the only thing that mattered was competence. You either knew what you were doing or you did not. You either kept your team alive or you failed them. No amount of charm or manipulation could change the reality of an explosive device buried in a road or hidden in the frame of a shattered building. I learned that lesson the hardest way possible in Afghanistan in 2017 when Staff Sergeant Nolan Frazier, a man who had become like an older brother to me, stepped on a device that no one had spotted. The sound is something I still hear sometimes in the middle of the night. A thud more than an explosion. A shift in the earth. The kind of sound that tells you the world has just changed forever. I remember the dust, the force of the blast, the way the sky seemed to dim for a moment. I remember kneeling beside what remained of the path we had been clearing and feeling my hands shake for the first time in years. After that day, I carried a quiet ache wherever I went. It settled under my ribs like a bruise that never healed. I never told my parents about Nolan or any of the others we lost in Syria or Somalia. Whenever I tried to explain the weight of those deployments, my mother would interrupt with something like, "You make everything sound so dramatic," or "You always focus on the worst parts." My father would tell me I chose that life and therefore had no right to complain about anything. Amber would say at least you get attention for what you do. There was no point trying to make them understand. They lived in a world where danger was something that happened on television, not in real deserts, under real suns with real people who never came home. So I stopped sharing. I stopped trying. I learned to keep my service life separated from my civilian life the way I kept classified files separated from my personal belongings. It was easier than letting their indifference bruise the parts of me that were still healing. But even with all that distance, I never expected how far they would go to make me small again. I never expected that the girl they had spent years calling dramatic would become the woman they accused of ruining her own ceremony. And I never expected that the people who should have protected me would be the ones who stepped aside while danger sat quietly beneath the chair meant to honor my service. I still remember the exact moment the email arrived. It was a gray morning at Camp Pendleton, the kind where the sky sat low enough to touch the tops of the barracks, and the air smelled faintly of salt blowing in from the Pacific. I had just finished a training rotation with a group of younger EOD techs, walking them through the slow, methodical process of approaching a suspicious vehicle and teaching them how to control their breathing when their instincts began screaming. I was exhausted but satisfied, the kind of tired that felt clean. When I returned to my office, the light on my computer was blinking. I expected paperwork or a scheduling update. I did not expect a message from Headquarters Marine Corps with a subject line that made my heart pause in my chest. Recommendation for Medal of Valor. For a moment, I just stared at the words. They did not seem real. Awards were things other people received, people whose families believed in them, people who did not spend their childhood being told to stop making a fuss. I clicked the email and read the opening sentences twice before the meaning finally sank into me. The board had reviewed the report from Iraq, the one involving the overturned MRAP, the one I still had dreams about, the one where 5 Marines had survived because of actions I barely remembered making. I felt my throat tighten as every detail came back with painful clarity. The heat in the air, the black smoke curling upward, the split second when instinct overrode fear. I remembered hearing the first explosion behind us, the sound jolting through the convoy like a command. The MRAP flipped on impact metal, shrieking as it rolled. I remembered running toward the wreckage while others shouted for me to wait. I remembered the angle of the vehicle, the smell of burning rubber, the panic in the trapped Marines' voices. I remembered cutting through a jammed harness with my bare hands after my knife slipped. I remembered dragging bodies out one by one while telling myself to ignore the shaking in my legs. And I remembered kneeling beside the last Marine whispering, "Stay with me," even though I had no idea if he could hear me anymore. Those were the minutes the medal was for. Minutes that felt like a lifetime and also like a blur I never fully emerged from. When I finished reading the email, my hands were trembling. Not from fear, from something heavier. Maybe relief. Maybe grief. Maybe the simple shock of realizing someone had seen me. Someone had acknowledged what I had done instead of calling it dramatic. My first instinct was not to call my parents. It was to call Gunnery Sergeant Cole Bennett, the man who had been in the convoy with me that day. The man who had shouted at me to get back when I ran toward the MRAP, but later told me I had saved lives he could not have reached in time. When he answered, I did not even say hello. I told him to check his inbox. A few seconds passed. Then I heard him exhale and say, "Maddox, you earned this." I smiled for the first time in days. With Cole, there was never judgment, never competition, just respect. I sent a quick text to 2 other Marines who had been part of the rotation, and then I sat alone in my office for several minutes, letting the reality settle in. Eventually, I forced myself to call home. I told myself they deserved to know. I told myself it was the right thing to do. I should have known better. My mother answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded distracted the way it always did when she was not the center of the conversation. I told her the board had recommended me for the Medal of Valor. There was a pause. A long one. Long enough for hope to rise inside me even though I knew it should not. Then she said, "Medals do not mean character." My grip on the phone tightened. I asked her what that was supposed to mean. She replied in the same soft tone she used whenever she wanted her words to sting without sounding cruel. It means anyone can collect medals, Riley. That does not say anything about how you treat people. I felt something inside me drop. I barely had time to absorb the blow before Amber chimed in from somewhere in the background. "Do not embarrass yourself wearing the uniform," I heard the smirk in her voice. My father added his own commentary while walking past the phone. "These things get handed out too easily these days." None of them asked what the medal was for. None of them asked how I was doing. None of them asked about the Marines I had pulled from the wreckage. They treated the news the same way they treated everything else in my life, as an inconvenience, as something exaggerated, as something that made them uncomfortable. I ended the call as politely as I could and stared at the blank screen for a long time afterward. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, the air heavier. I knew my family had never understood my service, but I had believed somewhere deep inside that this moment would matter to them, that hearing their oldest daughter had risked everything to save 5 lives would stir something human in them. I should have known that the things that move the rest of the world never seemed to move the Maddox household. Still, the words "do not embarrass yourself" repeated in my mind long after the call ended. I tried to brush them off, but they clung to me like dust you cannot wash away. Later that night, Cole found me in the hallway and asked if I had told my family. When I nodded, he studied my face for a moment and said, "You deserve better than whatever they said." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let his words sink in deeper than the ones my family had thrown at me. But the truth was, that moment carved a quiet line in me. A line I did not know would split open completely on the day of the ceremony. The day I discovered just how far my family was willing to go to keep me small. I flew into Boise 2 days before the ceremony because some small part of me still believed in doing the polite thing. I told myself it was courtesy. I told myself it was tradition. But deep down, I knew it was habit, the old familiar instinct of trying to keep peace in a house where peace had never existed. The October air in Idaho felt colder than the California coast, sharp enough to sting my lungs when I stepped outside the airport. I drove the rented SUV down the familiar streets of my childhood, but the closer I got to my parents' house, the tighter my stomach felt. Every tree and sidewalk carried old memories, none of them warm. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickered, casting the same sickly glow it had when I was a teenager sneaking inside after night drills with the JROTC. The house itself looked unchanged, a sag in the roofline, cracked paint on the siding, windows where the curtains never fully closed. It felt like stepping into a time capsule filled with every version of myself I had tried to grow out of. When I opened the front door, the familiar smell hit me first. Old carpet, reheated food, and something stale underneath it all. My mother was standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed as if she had been waiting only to measure how much space I took up. "Riley, you did not need to rush home," she said, though her tone suggested she wished I had not come at all. My father sat in his usual spot on the recliner, the television lighting his face in cold flashes. He glanced up long enough to nod before focusing on the screen again. The house felt smaller somehow. Not physically, but emotionally. The rooms seemed to shrink around me as if trying to push me back out the door. There was no sign anyone had prepared for the ceremony. No flowers. No card. No congratulations banner. No mention of the Medal of Valor at all. The only sign of change came from Amber, who appeared from the hallway wearing athletic wear and the smirk she reserved for moments when she wanted to remind me how irrelevant she believed I was. "Well, look who finally showed up," she said while adjusting her ponytail. "Guess the Marines decided you were worth benching for a few days." I set my bag down slowly. "Just here for the ceremony, Amber." She laughed lightly and examined her nails. "I am the one with the real achievements in this family. People know who I am. I get invited to events. You get sent overseas because no one wants you around here." The words were sharp but familiar. They rolled off her tongue with the same confidence she used in high school when she declared herself the pretty one while telling me I looked plain. I reminded myself not to react. I reminded myself that she thrived on provoking people. Instead, I walked to the kitchen hoping to find some neutral ground. But the energy there was just as tense. My mother sighed dramatically as she opened a drawer and pushed aside clutter. You still take everything so seriously, Riley. We are just trying to lighten the mood. I wanted to ask what mood she was referring to because from where I stood, the entire house radiated resentment. Years of jealousy, competition, and control lingered in the air like smoke. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I just needed to get through 48 hours. That was all. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt the old patterns tightening around me like a rope. My father finally spoke from the recliner without taking his eyes off the television. Military is not a real job. You leave for months and expect everyone to praise you for it. That is not how life works. I stared at him stunned, not by the words themselves, but by how casually he said them, as if insulting his oldest daughter was just another part of the nightly routine. I wanted to remind him that my job was the reason 5 Marines were alive. I wanted to tell him that the Medal of Valor was not something anyone received lightly, but instead I swallowed it. I told myself it was not worth fighting. I told myself I did not need their validation. I told myself I was strong enough to ignore the old wounds reopening. Still, I felt the sting, the kind that settles beneath your ribs and makes it hard to breathe. I walked down the hallway that used to be mine. The walls were still covered with photos of Amber from every stage of her life. Pageants, senior portraits, a framed newspaper clipping about some local award she won at 19. Not a single picture of me in uniform. Not one acknowledgement of the 11 years I had given to the Marine Corps. The silence inside the house deepened. My footsteps echoed too loudly as if I did not belong there anymore. Maybe I never had. When I placed my suitcase on the bed of the old guest room, I caught sight of the mirror. My reflection looked out of place. Stronger, older, sharper around the edges. I no longer matched the versions of myself that had once lived under this roof. I barely had time to gather myself before Amber appeared in the doorway with her arms crossed. "So, Mom says tomorrow is a big deal for you," she said in a tone that suggested otherwise. "Just do not make it weird. People will be watching." I took a deep breath. "Amber, I am not going there to impress you. I am going because I earned something significant." She smirked. "Do not embarrass yourself in that uniform. You always look stiff in it." Her words hit the same nerve the phone call had hit days earlier. The same one my mother poked every time she accused me of exaggeration. The same one my father struck whenever he dismissed my service. I felt anger rising inside me, but I forced it down. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself I could handle 2 days in this house. I told myself I could endure any insult if it meant maintaining some form of family peace. But deep down, something else was growing. Something quiet and cold. Something that told me peace was not what this family wanted from me. What they wanted was obedience, and I had spent too many years giving them exactly that. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from the device under my chair or from the chaos that would eventually surround the ceremony. It came quietly, subtly, almost casually, the way danger often walks into a room before anyone realizes it is there. It was the night before the ceremony, and the house felt heavier than usual. The kind of heaviness that settles in the corners and lingers in the spaces between sentences. Amber had been floating around all day with a strange brightness in her eyes, moving from room to room as if she were preparing for something only she knew about. At dinner, she twirled her fork between her fingers and said almost to herself, "I have a surprise planned for tomorrow." The words landed like a quiet thud inside my chest. She said them lightly, but something about the tone felt off. It was not the excitement of someone planning a gift. It was the kind of tone she used when she wanted attention. The kind she used when she wanted to be the center of something. My father laughed without looking up from his plate. "Amber always brings the entertainment." I forced a smile, even though a small flicker of unease had already begun forming in the back of my mind. I asked her what kind of surprise she meant. She tapped her nails on the table and shrugged. "You will see. Try not to ruin it by being uptight." My mother nodded without looking at me, as if Amber's cryptic comment were normal, as if I should not question it. By then I had already learned that my instincts were sharper than their intentions. But I let it go for the moment, telling myself I was imagining things. Telling myself I was tired. Telling myself I was letting the ceremony get in my head. Later that evening, I went to the living room to grab my phone charger from my pack. My pack was a standard issue Marine Corps assault bag, the one I always carried when traveling. I kept it zipped and tightened not because I had anything to hide, but because after years in the Corps, you learn to protect what is yours. When I walked in the room, the bag was open. Not unzipped, open, completely. The top flaps pulled apart, the contents shifted and exposed. I stopped so abruptly that my breath caught in my throat. My father was sitting on the couch flipping through a stack of papers from inside the pack. Sensitive training outlines, a restricted field manual, a sealed folder I had no intention of showing anyone. He held them as casually as if he were reading a grocery list. "Dad, what are you doing?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. He did not even flinch, just glanced at me over his reading glasses. "You left this lying around, so I opened it. You do not leave military stuff in my house." My hands curled at my sides. "That bag was zipped. You had to pull the straps apart to open it." He shrugged slowly as if the explanation were boring him. "Same thing." Not the same thing I said, but he lifted a hand for silence. "You are paranoid, Riley. I was just looking." Mom wandered in from the kitchen, wiping her hands with a towel. She glanced between us and sighed dramatically, as if I had created the problem by reacting at all. "Your father is allowed to look through things in his own home," she said. "Stop making it into something bigger." I ignored her and focused on the documents in his hands. "Those papers are classified. You cannot read them. You cannot even hold them without clearance. Put them back. Now." He scoffed. "Classified. Please. You act like you are some government operative. This is all theatrical. You are psycho about your job." His voice struck something raw in me. Years of deployments, years of danger, years of responsibility, reduced to psycho in one breath. I stepped forward, took the documents from his hands, and began placing everything back inside the bag deliberately, carefully, precisely, the way I had been trained. I checked the folder seals. I closed the straps. I resecured the zippers. My father watched with a smirk on his face as if my careful handling proved his point instead of proving how little he understood. Amber appeared in the doorway at that moment. She leaned against the frame with crossed arms and an amused expression. "Wow," she said quietly. "You are seriously overreacting. Again." I looked at her but said nothing. She liked it better when I reacted. It fed her. My silence disappointed her. She rolled her eyes and walked away. By then, the unease inside me had grown into something heavier, a pressure that pressed against my ribs, a feeling I had learned to recognize over the years. Something is coming. Something is wrong. Something is waiting. I closed the bag and held it to my chest for a moment. Not because of what was inside, but because of what had just happened. Boundaries did not exist in this house. Respect did not exist. Trust certainly did not exist. But this felt different. This felt intentional. Too intentional. My father leaned back in the recliner and turned the television volume up as if to declare the conversation over. My mother walked back to the kitchen without another word. The room fell back into its usual state of strained quiet. I stood in the hallway holding my pack and trying to shake the feeling settling deeper into my bones. The first sign of danger is never loud. It is a shift, a tone, a gesture. A comment that should not matter but does. Amber's surprise. My father breaking into my gear. My mother defending him. Their voices echoing in my head like old warnings. "You are dramatic. You are paranoid. You are psycho." And yet the truth settled cold in my chest. This time I was not imagining anything. Something was coming, and for the first time in my life I feared it would come from the people who shared my last name. The night before the ceremony felt like walking through a field of hidden wires, every step quiet but dangerous. I should have stayed in my hotel. I should have trusted my instincts. Instead, I let myself be pulled into the familiar gravity of the Maddox house where nothing good ever waited for me. My mother had insisted on hosting a small gathering with a few relatives and neighbors, something she called a casual evening to show support before your big day. The way she said big day made it sound like she was reading lines from a script she did not believe in. The living room was crowded when I walked in. bodies brushing past each other in a space too small for the number of voices spilling into it. The air smelled like reheated casserole and cheap wine. Everyone turned to look at me, but not in the warm way people look at someone they are proud of. Instead, I saw the brief flicker of curiosity, the quick scan from head to toe, the silent judgment lingering in the corners of their eyes. My mother clapped her hands together with forced cheer. "Everyone, this is Riley. You know she does something with the Marines." It was the way someone might introduce a neighbor who trimmed hedges for a living. A distant uncle I barely recognized chuckled and asked if I still crawled around deserts looking for toys to defuse. Before I could answer, my mother leaned in and said, "She is always so dramatic about her job. You know how she gets." The room laughed. Not loudly, worse, softly. The kind of laugh people use to smooth over cruelty. The kind that insists you are the problem for taking offense. I felt my jaw tighten. My father handed a drink to my cousin and loudly said, "Military life makes people touchy." I stood there listening to them analyze my life like it was a show they had no emotional investment in. Then Amber made her entrance. She walked down the hallway with a phone in her hand, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who knew she had an audience. She slipped her phone up at an angle and snapped a picture of me before I could react. The flash was unnecessary and intentional. I asked her what she was doing. She smirked. Sharing. People love updates. I did not think much of it until 10 minutes later when I heard two of my cousins snicker over something on a screen. I stepped closer and saw the post, a photo of me standing stiffly near the kitchen doorway with the caption, "Guess who still thinks she is saving the world tomorrow?" Amber had always been talented at turning me into a joke. I took a breath and reminded myself that losing my temper would only give her what she wanted. Instead, I excused myself and walked outside to get a moment of air, but the cold night offered no relief. My phone buzzed in my pocket. One new message from an unknown number. "You do not deserve tomorrow." The words sat on the screen like a punch waiting to land. No context, no explanation, only the sharp certainty of something malicious. I stared at it for several seconds before walking back inside. My heartbeat was steady but slow the way it gets when training shifts into instinct. I showed the message to my parents. They glanced at it for barely a second. My mother waved her hand. "Probably one of your soldier buddies joking." My father snorted. "You military people tease each other all the time." I looked directly at them. "This is not a joke. Someone sent this with intent." My mother sighed dramatically as if I were exhausting her. "Riley, you always twist things into something bigger. Tomorrow is stressful enough. Do not make it worse." I stood there stunned at how effortlessly she dismissed the threat. I wanted to shake them. I wanted to ask if they understood what my work entailed, what people were capable of, how threats were never harmless. But I knew the answer. They never listened. They never cared. Inside the living room, Amber raised her glass and said loudly, "I hope tomorrow goes smoothly." Would hate for Riley to blow up on stage. Several people laughed. My stomach tightened. I told myself to ignore the petty cruelty. I told myself it was only one more night. But the tension in the house kept thickening. Every time I moved, I felt eyes on me. Every whisper seemed to end with my name. Every laugh felt like a jab. At one point, my aunt pulled me aside and said in a half-whisper, "Amber has been so excited about tomorrow. She has something special planned. You should let her shine. Let her shine." That phrase echoed in my head, the same phrase my mother had used whenever she wanted me to step aside, the same phrase that always meant lose quietly so Amber can win loudly. I went upstairs to the guest room hoping for 5 minutes of quiet. When I closed the door, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling. My chest felt heavy. The message replayed in my mind. "You do not deserve tomorrow." The edges of the words pressed into me like cold needles. I checked the time. It was late, but the house was still loud. Laughter drifted up the stairs. Footsteps passed down the hallway, a muffled conversation about who would sit where at the ceremony. None of it felt right. I felt the same pressure I had felt during deployments when something unseen shifted in the environment. An invisible warning, a subtle vibration in the air, a reminder that danger rarely announces itself loudly. It comes quietly, slowly, and usually from directions you least expect. When I came back downstairs, Amber was showing someone another picture of me. Everyone else kept laughing like the night belonged only to them. I stood there in the doorway and felt more alone in my childhood home than I had ever felt on any battlefield. That was the moment the emotional drop hit me like a cold wave. I realized the countdown to the ceremony might not be counting toward celebration at all. It might be counting toward something else entirely, something darker, something waiting just out of sight. And the worst part was knowing that if something did happen tomorrow, the people in this house would still find a way to call it my fault. The morning of the ceremony rose with the sharp clarity of a day that knew it would be remembered. The sky over Camp Pendleton was a spotless blue, the kind that made the air feel crisp and almost ceremonial on its own. Driving through the main gate in my dress blues, I felt the familiar shift inside me. The tightening of posture, the quieting of thoughts, the sense of stepping back into a world where order existed and competence mattered. Marines in their service uniforms lined the walkways leading toward the parade grounds. Banners hung from the railings red and gold, catching the sun in bright slices. Rows of white folding chairs were arranged with perfect precision, each one angled exactly the same. The podium was set the Marine Corps flag and the American flag standing tall behind it, unmoving in the still morning air. Families had already begun gathering clusters of parents, spouses, children, and retirees, filling the space with murmured conversations and camera flashes. The ceremony was still hours away, but the energy had already started building. A hum of anticipation, a quiet pride, a reverence for the moment. I took a slow breath. This was the environment where I belonged, not a cluttered Idaho living room filled with backhanded comments. Here, people saw me. Here, my work was understood. Here, respect came naturally. My parents and Amber arrived 20 minutes later. I saw them before they saw me walking across the lawn with irritated expressions as they scanned the crowd. My father wore a suit that did not quite fit. My mother wore a dress too formal for the event, and Amber wore something tight enough to ensure she would be noticed, even if she were not the one being honored. When they finally spotted me, they waved with the stiff politeness of people greeting someone they were pretending to support. I walked toward them, rehearsing the calm tone I had learned to use around them. But before I reached them, Lieutenant Harper, one of the officers I had trained with last year, stepped forward with a bright smile. "Captain Maddox, good to see you again. Congratulations, ma'am." He shook my hand, and another Marine approached to offer his own congratulations. Then another, and then another. A small gathering formed around me, familiar faces from past deployments. Young Marines I had instructed, officers who had read the incident report from Iraq. My parents stood behind them, watching each handshake with narrowed eyes. My mother frowned as if the attention were unbecoming. My father shifted his feet with growing impatience. Amber's expression tightened, the muscles in her jaw pulling inward the way they did when she realized someone else was receiving the spotlight she believed should belong to her. When the crowd around me thinned for a moment, Amber moved in quickly, placing a hand on my arm. "Wow," she said through a forced smile. "So many people acting like you are important today." I turned toward her. "It is a military ceremony. Attention is part of the environment." She scoffed. "Sure, but do not let it go to your head. People love heroes for a day. Then they forget you." My mother nodded approvingly as if Amber had said something wise. My father looked around at the Marines walking past us with a hint of irritation. He muttered under his breath, "I do not get why they fuss over this stuff. It is just a job." I felt the familiar pressure in my chest but forced myself to stay composed. I reminded myself that this was not the time for confrontation, not with so much tension already simmering beneath the surface. As we walked toward the seating area, more Marines greeted me. Some stopped in genuine respect. Others paused simply to say congratulations. Each interaction seemed to irritate Amber more. She kept adjusting her hair, checking her phone, repositioning herself in ways that made it clear she believed the ceremony had become a competition she had not agreed to, but still expected to win. At one point, a group of officers from the EOD company approached. "Captain Maddox, we are glad you made it. The colonel is looking forward to speaking with you." The colonel's name alone made Amber flinch. She looked at me then, at them, then back at me again, as if she had suddenly realized I was existing in a world she knew nothing about. A world she could not measure herself against. A world where her usual tricks held no weight. My father cleared his throat loudly. "Must be nice to have people lined up to compliment you," he said. "Meanwhile, the rest of us are standing around like extras." The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. My mother touched his arm gently. "Stop it, Mark. People will hear you." But she said it only for appearances. Her eyes showed the same jealousy his voice carried. The tension between them and the Marine Corps' environment grew more obvious by the minute. Every salute directed toward me tightened the air. Every respectful nod seemed to scratch at something raw inside them. Shoes clicked against concrete. Flags shifted slightly in the breeze that had finally arrived. Families took their seats. The senior officers began gathering near the podium. The ceremony was drawing near, and with every passing minute I felt the divide between my two worlds widening. Camp Pendleton carried a kind of sharp clarity. Discipline, honor, accountability. My family radiated something else entirely. Resentment, competition, quiet hostility wrapped in polite smiles. When we reached the VIP section, my assigned seat stood near the front row, marked with my name. The exact same seat where hours later everything would fall apart. My mother looked at the placement and frowned. "Seems excessive," she whispered. Amber crossed her arms. "Do not forget who the real star in this family is." I looked at them both and felt the same cold weight I had felt the night before. An invisible warning, a steady hum of tension. A signal that something was building just beneath the surface. The ceremony had not started yet, the danger had not revealed itself, but the unease inside me pressed deeper. Something was coming, and despite the clear sky above us and the proud banners waving in the wind, I felt the first shift in the air, the shift that said the storm was closer than any of us knew. The moment my hand brushed the metal under my chair, the world around me narrowed into a single pinpoint. I had been adjusting the crease of my dress blues, smoothing the edge of the uniform, before taking my seat for the pre-ceremony briefing. The air smelled of pressed fabric, fresh-cut grass, and the faint oil that clings to rifles during inspections. Children laughed somewhere behind the seating rows. A speaker tested the microphone with a soft echo. It should have been an ordinary military ceremony morning. But danger never cares how important the day is. It arrives when it wants silent and patient. I crouched down to place my cover beneath my assigned seat. My fingers slid across the underside of the folding chair and hit something that did not belong. A shape, metallic, cold, with edges not smooth enough to be structural. I froze. My breath caught, suspended halfway in my throat. The air changed. Sounds grew distant, muffled by the rush of my pulse. My vision sharpened the way it had during operations in Iraq, when the smallest detail on the ground could decide whether we lived or became names whispered during evening roll call. The old instincts surged back instantly. I leaned in closer, careful not to shift the chair. A cluster of wires, a pressure strip, a small casing dark enough that the shadow beneath the seat nearly hid it. Improvised, not manufactured. Not part of ceremonial equipment. The shape was unmistakable to someone who had spent her entire adult life studying such things. My stomach tightened so fast it felt like the breath had been punched out of me. The bright California morning vanished, replaced by the memory of sandstorms, burnt metal, and the bone-deep heat of a battlefield. My body remembered before my mind did. The blast in Helmand. The ruined MRAP in Mosul. The way Nolan Fraser had shouted for everyone to stay back. The feeling of kneeling beside devices that did not care about rank or age or promises. I pulled my hand back with slow precision and stood upright. My voice came out lower and steadier than I expected. "Corporal, get EOD. Now." The corporal blinked once, saw the expression in my eyes, and sprinted without question. The shift around us happened quickly. Marines nearby adjusted their stances. A quiet ripple moved through the seating rows. Officers looked up. Radios clicked. A controlled urgency replaced the earlier calm. But my family had no idea what was unfolding. My mother frowned from several feet away, as if the commotion were annoying. Amber rolled her eyes, clearly irritated that attention had shifted yet again away from her. My father muttered something under his breath that I could not hear but knew would not be helpful. The EOD team arrived within less than a minute. 3 techs, focused, sharp, already putting on gloves. I led them to the chair and stepped back. The lead tech knelt, angled a mirror beneath the seat, and froze for a fraction of a second too small for untrained eyes to notice. But I noticed. He inhaled tightly through his nose before speaking in a low voice, meant only for the team and me. "This is a live device." The words dropped into the air like a shockwave. Amber had been walking toward us with her arms crossed when she heard him. The color drained from her face so fast it was like watching a curtain fall. Her lips parted. Her posture stiffened. Her phone slipped slightly in her hand before she caught it. My mother blinked, confused. "Live device." "What do you mean, live device?" My father scoffed loudly for everyone within 10 yards to hear. "Oh, for God's sake! Riley, you are ruining this day. You always overreact." The lead tech looked up sharply at him, startled by the tone. "Sir, this is not overreaction. This device is functional." The younger Marine next to him swallowed hard before repeating the word none of my family members had the decency or intelligence to understand. Improvised explosive device, IED. Amber flinched as if someone had slapped her. My mother pressed a hand to her chest. My father shook his head aggressively. "Someone is playing a prank. This is ridiculous. This is embarrassing. Embarrassing." His choice of word hit me harder than the discovery itself. Embarrassing, not dangerous, not horrifying. Not "we could have lost you," just embarrassing. People around us had started whispering. A few guests covered their mouths. A couple stepped backward from the row. A senior officer approached and asked if we needed to evacuate the seating area. EOD signaled yes. They moved swiftly, quietly, isolating the chair, cordoning off the space, securing the device. Cameras clicked. People watched. For the first time that morning, all eyes were not on the banners or the polished uniforms, but on me, and on the thing hidden beneath the seat where I was supposed to sit minutes later. My father jabbed a finger toward me and hissed, "You always bring drama everywhere you go. Could you not let your sister have one day of peace?" I stared at him. My voice came out soft, almost too soft. "There is a live device under my seat, and your concern is embarrassment." Amber swallowed again, her face still pale, her hands still shaking slightly, though she tried to hide it. My mother whispered, "Maybe it is a piece of equipment. Maybe it is part of the chairs." The young Marine beside us looked horrified. "Ma'am." That device could have critically injured her instantly. The crowd heard him, all of them. His words echoed across the open space. People turned. Eyes widened, whispers intensified. Public embarrassment, the first of many. Except it was not my embarrassment. It was theirs. They just did not know it yet. I felt the heat rising behind my eyes, but not from fear, not from shock, from clarity. A cold, unmistakable clarity. Someone had put that device there. Someone who had access. Someone who had reason. Someone who had once walked into the preparation area hours earlier claiming she wanted to leave me a gift. And now she stood 10 feet away, trying to keep her breathing steady. Something inside me shifted then. An understanding. A recognition. A final crack in the illusion I had spent years trying to maintain. The illusion that my family was merely difficult, flawed, imperfect. They were not flawed. They were dangerous. And the day was only just beginning. The moment the EOD team confirmed the device was live, protocol shifted into motion with the precision of a machine that had been built from decades of military discipline. Within minutes, a pair of CID agents strode across the field, their presence unmistakable in plain clothes that somehow still carried the weight of authority. They spoke briefly with the EOD techs before turning to me, their expressions controlled but alert. "Captain Maddox, we need to ask you a few questions." I nodded already, stepping away from the cluster of onlookers whose murmurs were growing louder with each passing second. They led me toward the administrative building beside the parade grounds, a place with stark walls and windows tinted dark enough to swallow sunlight. Inside, one of the agents introduced himself as Special Agent Saunders, his partner as Special Agent Loris. Their demeanors were professional, steady, and unmistakably serious. The kind of seriousness that meant this investigation was not going to be treated as a mishap or a prank. One of them clicked a pen. "Captain, was anyone besides Marine personnel around your assigned seat before you arrived?" The answer formed before the question even finished. "Yes. My sister. She came in early, said she wanted to leave a small gift on my seat." Both agents exchanged a glance so slight it barely existed, but I caught it. Instinctively, I knew the investigation had just shifted from procedural to focused. They thanked me, told me to wait in the adjoining room, and stepped out into the hallway. Through the glass, I watched them confer with the EOD team, the officers, the personnel overseeing the ceremony. Tension rippled outward from every conversation. This was no longer a security concern, it was a criminal act. Within half an hour, CID began pulling security footage from the preparation hall. They projected it onto a monitor in a dim room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paperwork. I stood in the back as the footage played, my hands clasped behind me, my breathing steady only because I forced it to be. At first, the footage showed Marines arranging chairs. Nothing unusual. Then the camera angle shifted. At 1324, the door opened. Amber stepped inside, alone. She looked around with that irritated flick she did whenever she felt inconvenienced by the world. She walked straight to my row, straight to my seat. She bent down, stayed there for longer than any normal person would while placing something under a chair. The footage zoomed in enough to show her body blocking the view of what her hands were doing. Then she stood, dusted off her dress as if something had stuck to her, and walked out of the hall with a glancing look over her shoulder. A look that made the air feel thin. The room stayed silent long after the footage ended. I could hear the faint hum of the projector cooling down. One of the agents finally spoke. "We need to bring her in." I stared at the screen, watching the image freeze on Amber's face. She looked satisfied in the footage, focused, intentional, the same expression she wore when she wanted to make sure someone noticed the trouble she had created. My stomach tightened. A cold ache spread through my chest. They escorted her and my parents into a nearby office for questioning. I stayed outside the closed door, listening through the thin air as much as through the sounds that seeped out between sentences. The interrogation began with simple questions. "Where were you earlier today? Why were you alone in the preparation hall? Did you place anything under the chairs?" Amber's answers were slippery, nervous, grinding against each other like gears stripped of alignment. I do not remember going inside. I might have dropped something. I did not touch anything. I was only putting down a small gift. I never went near her chair. The contradictions piled up so quickly that even my mother's rehearsed calm began cracking. I heard chairs scrape against the floor, heard the rising irritation in my father's voice, heard the first tremors of defensiveness sharpen into anger. When the agents presented the footage, there was a long pause, a suffocating one. Then my father snarled loud enough that everyone in the hallway heard it. "This is ridiculous! That footage proves nothing! You are all clowns! Clowns!" He called federal military investigators clowns. One of the agents responded in a tone so measured it could have cut steel. "Sir, we have visual confirmation of your daughter tampering with the area under Captain Maddox's seat." My mother's voice rose next, shaking but defiant. She probably dropped an earring, or was cleaning something. "You are turning this into something it is not," Agent Loris replied calmly. "Ma'am, placing an object under a VIP seat in a restricted area is not something small." Amber's voice cracked through the door. "I did not do anything. People always think the worst of me because of her. Because of her." Another twist of blame, another attempt to twist the narrative. I listened as she scrambled through excuses, each more desperate than the last, until her voice thinned into silence. The temperature in the hallway felt colder, tighter, heavy with something ugly rising to the surface. After a few more minutes, the agents opened the door. My parents emerged first, their expressions twisted with indignation rather than concern. My mother brushed past me, muttering, "They are framing her." My father glared at me as though I had orchestrated the investigation myself. "This is what you do. You turn everything into drama." Amber followed them, eyes red mascara smudged, but not from remorse. From frustration. From being cornered. From losing control of the narrative. She would not look at me. Not once. CID said they needed to continue the investigation and that no one was allowed to leave base until further notice. My parents erupted again, complaining about time, about inconvenience, about being treated unfairly. Not once did they ask if I was all right. Not once did they acknowledge the danger. Not once did they show the slightest fear that their daughter might have been harmed. And as the CID agents stepped away to expand their investigation, one truth settled so firmly in my chest that it felt immovable. The danger under my chair was deliberate, and the people who should have protected me were the first ones trying to bury the truth. The investigation should have made me feel safer, but instead it carved out a hollow space inside my chest that only grew colder with each passing hour. CID had secured the area, isolated the device, and begun interviewing everyone who had access to the preparation hall, but the questions slowly shifted in a direction I did not expect, a direction that made my skin tighten and my throat dry. Special Agent Saunders pulled me into a private office, closing the door quietly behind him. His tone was calm, polite, almost too controlled. "Captain Maddox, we need to ask you something directly." I braced myself. "Go ahead." He exchanged a glance with Agent Loris before continuing. "Do you have any enemies on base?" The question felt like a blade sliding somewhere between my ribs, not because it was offensive, but because it carried an implication, the kind of implication that suggested I might somehow be connected to the threat. I kept my voice steady. "Not that I am aware of. Anyone you recently disciplined, anyone who resented you, anyone who might want to disrupt your ceremony." My answer remained the same. "No." He leaned forward slightly. "Anyone who might benefit from making you appear vulnerable." The air thinned. Beneath the surface of his tone, I heard the unspoken possibility, the silent suspicion. It wrapped around me like ice. "Are you asking if I staged this?" My voice came out quiet but sharp. Both agents denied it immediately, but their expressions said enough. They were not accusing, but they were considering. Procedure required it. Bureaucracy demanded it. And regardless of their tone, the seed of doubt had already been planted. When they released me, I walked into the hallway and felt the weight of new eyes on me. Officers who had shaken my hand that morning now looked at me as if I had become a question they were not sure how to answer. A captain nearby whispered to another, and they both glanced at me before quickly turning away. Two younger Marines stiffened when I passed, their posture shifting with a subtle hesitation I had never seen directed at me before. My chest tightened. It was the same look I had seen in Iraq when someone suspected a teammate of misreading a threat. The look that said trust was suspended. The look that said something about you had become uncertain. Word traveled fast on base, faster than truth, faster than facts. And before the investigation had even finished reviewing the footage, rumors had started forming. I overheard fragments as I walked past the admin offices. Maybe she panicked. Maybe she imagined it. Maybe she put something there herself. So people would finally pay attention. The words sliced through me with cold precision. A different kind of gaslighting, not from family this time, from the institution I had served for more than a decade. The same institution I had nearly died serving. The same institution that was supposed to know me better than anyone. I tried to shake it off. I told myself rumors were normal. People always speculated before facts arrived, but the sting settled deep, anchoring itself inside me. It did not lessen when a senior officer approached me later. Hands clasped behind his back, voice neutral. "Captain, until CID completes their findings, some personnel may be required to distance themselves." I blinked. Distance. From me. I wanted to ask if he remembered the 5 Marines I had pulled from the overturned MRAP, if he remembered the commendations he had signed, if he remembered the briefings I had led. If he remembered the nights I had spent in the field training the younger techs because they trusted me enough to ask for extra help. Instead, all I said was understood. He nodded once and walked away. Just like that, an invisible wall rose between me and the people I had risked my life for. The kind of wall that did not need words to exist. Across the field, I saw Amber standing beside my mother and father. CID had kept them on base for further questioning, which only fueled their indignation. My father glared at every passing Marine as though they were all personally insulting him by doing their jobs. My mother stood with her arms crossed tightly, her expression twisted with offense instead of fear. Amber looked rattled, but not enough. Not in the way someone should look after being caught on camera near a restricted area. Instead, she kept glancing at me with a kind of resentment that ran deeper than guilt. My parents saw me walking toward them, and my mother immediately spoke. "What did they ask you? Did they accuse Amber? Tell them it is all a misunderstanding." Her voice cracked like she was the one in danger. My father added loudly, "You always blow things out of proportion. If you had not acted so dramatic, this would not have escalated." I stared at them, feeling every part of me collapsing inward. CID questioned me about staging the incident, I said quietly. Both of them froze. Only for a moment. Then my father scoffed. "Well, maybe you should not jump to conclusions. You make everything look suspicious." My mother nodded sharply. "And honestly, Riley, they probably got that idea because of how you always react. Always making yourself the center of everything." The words struck with the same force they always had, like old bruises being pressed again and again. Except this time, I did not have the strength to absorb them. Not after the base had started turning its eyes away from me. Not after CID had asked if I had enemies. Not after whispers had begun forming about staging and drama. For the first time since the device had been found, my breathing faltered. The edges of my vision blurred slightly. I felt cornered on all sides, questioned by strangers, doubted by people I respected, abandoned by the people who were supposed to know me best. Standing there between two worlds, both of them treating me like I was the problem, I felt something inside me fall to its lowest point. This was the emotional low I had never allowed myself to reach in combat zones. Yet here it was, on home soil, delivered not by enemies, but by family colleagues and the very institution I dedicated my life to. I stood perfectly still, staring at the parade grounds as Marines moved around me with purpose, while my world silently fractured beneath my feet. For the first time in years, I felt the urge to break. And for the first time, I let myself realize it. Something inside me was collapsing. And the worst part was knowing I had to keep standing anyway. I thought the lowest point had already passed, but I underestimated how quickly my family could dig further beneath the floor of my expectations. By the afternoon of the investigation, the whispers on base had grown into cautious speculation. Most people kept their distance out of protocol, but distance has a way of becoming suspicion in places where discipline controls every movement. I could have handled that. I had handled worse in deployment zones. But what came next did not come from strangers or colleagues or the cold machinery of military procedure. It came from the three people who should have stood between me and the world, not pushed me into its path. Mark and Diane did not just defend Amber when CID questioned her. They went further. Much further. They stepped outside the administration building after yet another round of interviews, and instead of staying silent like they were instructed, my father approached a small group of Marines waiting by the walkway. He raised his voice deliberately, making sure others could hear. Riley probably staged this, he announced like it was a fact he had been waiting to deliver. "You know how she loves attention." I had just walked outside when I heard it, his words slicing through the air like a blade. A corporal standing nearby stiffened. A staff sergeant glanced at me with shock. My face burned. Not from shame, but from the cruel absurdity of hearing my own father try to rewrite the day I nearly died into a performance. My mother chimed in with her own version, shaking her head as if she felt pity for me. "She does these things when she feels overlooked. She has always been dramatic. You will learn that about her." She said it to a Marine captain who had served with me in training exercises. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent out of respect for protocol. I wished he had said something. Anything. But this was the military. Order always came first, truth was second, and family had somehow become the enemy. Within minutes, the rumor had legs. I overheard it near the water station, near the logistics tent, near the perimeter where MPs stood guard. Maybe Captain Maddox planted something. Maybe she panicked and wanted an excuse. Maybe she was cracking from her deployment stress. Each whispered speculation added another stone to the weight inside my chest, and my family kept feeding it, pouring more fuel onto a fire they did not even acknowledge they had lit. I confronted them behind the admin building away from the crowd, but still close enough to feel the energy of the base humming nearby. "Why are you saying these things?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "Because someone needs to tell the truth," my father replied. "You always twist stories to fit whatever drama you want. Maybe now people will finally see it." My mother crossed her arms. "And stop acting like you are the victim!" "Amber is shaken. She is younger than you. She should not have to deal with this stress." I stared at them, words trapped somewhere behind my ribs. I had no answer for cruelty this deliberate. It was one thing not to understand me. It was another to try to destroy me. Before I could speak, my phone buzzed. A notification. A message. From Amber. "You are pathetic." Just 2 words. 2 words sharp enough to slice through the part of me still clinging to hope. I looked up and found her standing a few yards away with her arms folded, eyes narrowed. The same cold satisfaction she wore whenever she successfully hurt someone. She mouthed something I could not hear, but I knew exactly what it was. "You deserve this." For a moment, I felt my knees weaken. The ground felt unsteady. My heart sank into a place I had sworn never to return to. The feeling was not fear. It was something worse. Something that felt like resignation. I felt myself drifting backward into old patterns, the ones where I always shrank so they could feel tall. The ones where I apologized to keep peace, even over things I never caused. The ones where I carried the blame they handed me. A part of me wanted to walk back into the admin building and tell CID to stop, to drop the investigation, to pretend this was all a misunderstanding, to let them think whatever they wanted, to let my family win just so I did not have to feel this crushing isolation anymore. I imagined myself saying, "Forget it." I imagined myself saying maybe it was nothing. I imagined myself stepping aside and letting the narrative swallow me whole, because it would be easier than standing alone against the pressure from every direction. The thought terrified me. "Riley." A voice broke through the haze. It belonged to Lieutenant Harper. He stepped beside me without asking, his expression pulled tight with concern. "Are you all right?" I tried to answer, but the words would not come. He saw something in my face and lowered his voice. "Do not let anyone twist this. You know what you saw. You know what you felt under that seat. You know what almost happened." His words grounded me just enough to keep me from falling apart. But the truth lingered like a shadow. I had spent my entire life fighting battles that no one else ever saw, fighting to be heard, fighting to be believed, fighting to stand tall in a house built to keep me small. And now I was standing in the middle of Camp Pendleton, a place that had shaped me, broken me, rebuilt me, and still the only voices echoing in my head were the ones telling me I was nothing, pathetic, dramatic, delusional. A part of me wanted to quit, walk away, collapse into the version of myself they had always tried to force me into. But another part of me, the part built from sandstorms and fire and nights spent clearing roads under enemy fire, whispered something else. "You survived worse than this. You will not fall because they want you to." I closed my eyes for a second, just long enough to breathe, long enough to steady the shaking in my hands, long enough to decide which version of myself I would allow to rise again. When I opened them, the decision was made. This was not over. Not for me, and not for the people who believed they could destroy me with whispers. The breaking point did not arrive with sirens or shouting or some dramatic confrontation the way people imagine justice unfolds. It arrived quietly, almost anticlimactic on the surface, delivered in the form of a simple voicemail notification on my phone. A single message, a tiny digital envelope glowing on the screen. the kind of thing anyone would ignore on a normal day. But nothing about this day was normal, and somewhere deep in my bones, I already knew that whatever waited inside that message would tilt the ground beneath my feet. I was sitting alone on the concrete steps outside the CID building, elbows on my knees, staring at the asphalt as the last light of the afternoon stretched into long shadows across the pavement. The whispers had thickened, the stares had sharpened. My parents' accusations had made their rounds. Amber's text, "You're pathetic," still pulsed through my veins like poison, and I felt empty, completely empty. Then my phone buzzed. The name, flashing across the screen, hit me like a spark flaring in dry brush. Staff Sergeant Logan Pierce, a former EOD tech I had served with in Syria. We had not spoken for months. He was the kind of Marine who did not get involved in drama, who never called unless something mattered. Really mattered. I opened the voicemail. His voice came through low, urgent, almost whispered, as if he was hiding from someone. "Riley, I don't know what's happening over there, but I think you need to hear this immediately." Then another voice cut in. A woman's voice, bright, high-pitched, too cheerful. I felt my entire body jolt. It was Amber. The audio was grainy, like it had been recorded at a party or someone's house. People were talking in the background. Music thumped faintly beneath the chatter, but her voice came through with perfect clarity as she spoke to a friend. "I told you, she doesn't deserve a medal or a ceremony, so I prepared something to ruin her special day. You should have seen how stressed she looked. She's probably over there crying or panicking like always." The friend laughed. Amber laughed louder. My heartbeat slammed into my ribs so hard I thought I might black out. I replayed the clip. Once, twice, 5 times. Each repetition peeled another layer off my denial. My little sister, laughing, boasting, bragging about preparing something to sabotage the ceremony where I was supposed to receive the highest recognition of my career. I felt my lungs tighten until breathing became a conscious effort. My hands trembling, my vision tunneling. Everything else, the stares, the rumors, the humiliation my family had spread, suddenly clicked into place like a detonator snapping against the fuse. My family had not just dismissed what happened. They had tried to make me doubt myself. They had tried to bury the truth. And Amber had done something deliberate, something planned, something malicious. I sat frozen for nearly a full minute before I realized my nails had dug into my palms so hard that half-moons of red were forming. When I finally stood, the world steadied beneath my feet. The exhaustion that had dragged at every step began to lift. Something colder replaced it, something sharper, something that felt like resolve forged under pressure I had not known I was capable of surviving. I walked straight into the CID building. The young agent at the desk stood when he saw my face. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "No, but I have something you need to hear." I handed him the phone. He didn't move for several seconds. His jaw clenched slowly tight enough to shift the muscles along his temple. He pressed a button rewound and listened again, then again. Then he called for his supervising agent. Within minutes, 3 investigators crowded around the desk. The recording played on speaker. Amber's voice echoed through the CID lobby. Bright, careless, disgustingly proud. The supervising agent looked up at me with a slow exhale. "Captain Maddox, this is substantial." My throat felt raw when I answered. "She did something. I don't know what exactly, but she did something." He nodded. "We will verify everything, but this changes the direction of the investigation." Every second of the next hour felt like wading through storm water rising level by level. They brought me into the interview room again. This time, the tone had shifted unmistakably. They no longer saw me as a possible suspect or a source of confusion. They saw me as a victim of a calculated act. They saw me as someone fighting to be heard. They saw me. I watched as they replayed the audio and took notes. I answered every question with clearer strength than I'd had all day. "Where were you standing when you discovered the device? Did your sister see you approach the seating area? Did she have prior access to your belongings? Did she express hostility toward the ceremony beforehand?" Every detail snapped into place like puzzle pieces that had been scattered across the floor. My instinct, the moment I saw the device, the way Amber had hovered, the tension in her voice the night before, the text she sent dripping with contempt, the subtle comments about surprises, the way she had turned pale when EOD announced the device was live. The investigators exchanged glances, the kind trained agents give each other when the pieces begin forming an undeniable picture. One of them leaned back in his chair. "Captain Maddox, the evidence is beginning to align with your account." That sentence. I had waited my entire life to hear something like it, to have someone believe me without twisting it, to have someone examine the truth without trying to bury it. For a moment, the weight on my chest loosened enough to let one full breath in, a clean breath, a steadying breath. Then something unexpected happened. The supervising agent's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then his brows lifted. "Security just sent us something relevant." He stood and motioned for us to follow him down the hall to the security office. Inside, 2 MPs sat huddled over a monitor. The agent leaned forward. "Show us." They played the footage, an exterior camera, a walkway near the VIP tent. Amber walking quickly toward the seating area 2 hours before the ceremony, holding something dark and rectangular in her hand. She glanced around, tucked it under her jacket, stepped behind the seating rows, knelt, stood, brushed her hair back like nothing happened, and walked off. My heart did not drop. It did not break. It hardened. The room was silent for several seconds. The supervising agent finally turned to me. "Captain, we need to move forward with a formal shift in the investigation. The evidence points toward intentional placement, toward your sister." The world steadied again, or maybe for the first time, because suddenly I was no longer fighting shadows, no longer fighting whispers, no longer fighting alone. The truth was no longer a question. It was becoming fact. And the weight my family had forced onto my shoulders was finally starting to slip off. I exhaled slowly. For the first time all day, the breath did not hurt. This was only the beginning. But for the first time, I felt the ground tilt toward me instead of against me. The tide was turning, and this time it was turning in the direction of truth. The confrontation that followed was not planned, not orchestrated, not even predictable. It unfolded with the kind of raw intensity that only happens when truth collides with years of denial inside a place where no one can hide. CID notified my family they needed to return to Camp Pendleton for additional questioning. I heard about it only because one of the agents told me quietly warning that the next few hours would be difficult. Difficult was an understatement. When my parents and Amber walked through the corridor leading to the interview rooms, the entire energy of the building seemed to shift. Marines passing through slowed their steps. Admin clerks glanced up from their work. Even seasoned CID officers straightened, sensing the tension humming in the air. My family always carried chaos with them, but this time the chaos had consequences. Real ones. Amber looked smaller than before. Her hair was messy, pulled into a rushed ponytail, and her eyes darted from door to door like she expected someone to leap out and accuse her on the spot. My mother clutched her purse with both hands, jaw tight, eyes already narrowed as if preparing to attack the moment she saw something she disliked. My father walked stiffly, chest out, trying to look in control, though his face twitched every few seconds. They had no idea I was standing at the far end of the hall with 2 CID agents behind me. When Amber finally noticed me, she flinched. Not dramatically, not exaggerated, just a small, involuntary recoil that told me guilt was no longer theoretical. It was consuming her. The supervising agent stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Maddox, Miss Maddox, thank you for coming. We have additional questions regarding the device found at the ceremony." My mother crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous. We already told you our daughter is overreacting." My father grunted in agreement. "You people want someone to blame. You should be thanking us for cooperating instead of dragging us back here." The agent didn't even blink. "If you would follow me." They were led into interview room 3. I watched them go. Part of me felt sick. Part of me felt vindicated. Most of me felt nothing at all. Numbness had become its own armor. 10 minutes passed before I was called in as well, not to be questioned this time, but to observe. The supervising agent said it would be useful for them to see that the investigation had progressed beyond speculation. When I entered the room, my parents immediately bristled. My mother glared at the agents. "Why is she here? This is harassment." My father jabbed a finger toward me. "She's manipulating you. She always does this." Amber sat silently, shoulders tight, eyes red, like she had been crying alone in the car. The supervising agent stood beside the table. "We have reviewed new evidence." He pressed a button and a still image appeared on the wall monitor. Amber kneeling behind the VIP seating row, her hand reaching under my chair. My mother's mouth fell open. My father jerked back as if slapped. Amber's face lost what little color remained. The agent switched to the audio recording. Amber's voice filled the room. Bright, careless, gloating. "I prepared something to ruin her special day." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's eyes bulged. Amber shook her head quickly. "That's taken out of context. You don't understand." The agent paused the audio. "Miss Maddox, can you explain what context would justify placing any device beneath a seat at a Marine Corps ceremony?" Amber stammered. "I didn't mean for it to be dangerous. It was just supposed to scare her, make her look stupid, not hurt her." My father exploded. "You idiot! Do you know what this looks like? Do you know what kind of trouble you've brought on this family?" My mother turned her outrage toward me as if I were somehow to blame. "Riley, look what you've done to your sister." I stared at her, a cold disbelief spreading through my chest. "What she's done." The supervising agent folded his hands. "Mrs. Maddox, your daughter. Captain Maddox did not record this audio. Your younger daughter did. She also entered a restricted area on camera. The evidence is clear." My mother's voice rose. "This is a family issue. Why are you acting like she's a criminal?" My father slammed his palm on the table. "This is ridiculous. You're treating us like criminals too." The supervising agent didn't raise his voice even a fraction. "Sir, a device was placed inside a controlled military installation. That is not a family issue. That is a federal crime." His calmness was more devastating than any shouting could have been. For the first time, my parents realized this was not a disagreement, not a misunderstanding, not something they could minimize by yelling louder. It was real, and they were losing control. Amber looked at me with tears gathering in her eyes. "Riley, please. You know I would never try to harm you. You know that." There it was, the pivot point. The moment guilt tried to disguise itself as innocence. I took a slow breath. "Amber, you bragged about ruining my ceremony. You walked into a secured area. You placed something under my seat, and you laughed about it." Her lip trembled. "I didn't know it would get this serious." My father lunged forward again. "This is your fault. You're blowing everything out of proportion. You always twist things." The supervising agent held up a hand. "Enough." His voice carried the authority of someone who had been patient for far too long. What happened next was the exact moment everything inside me broke open. The agent pressed another button. A second camera angle appeared, clearer, closer. Amber kneeling behind the row, looking around, slipping the object into place. My mother gasped. My father went silent in a way I had never seen before. Amber whispered something that sounded like I didn't think anyone would see me. The supervising agent spoke again. "Miss Maddox, you will be held for further questioning. MP personnel will escort you." The door opened and 2 MPs stepped inside. My mother screamed, actually screamed. "No, you can't take her. She didn't do anything wrong. This is insane." My father pointed at the officers. "Do not touch my daughter. You're all liars. This is a setup." The officers didn't react. They were Marines. They had seen worse. My sister stood up slowly as if her legs could barely hold her. She looked at me one last time, a pleading look, a look begging for me to save her, to intervene, to stop the consequences she had brought onto herself. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't look away. This was the second public exposure moment, and unlike the first, I felt no shame. only clarity. The MPs led Amber out, my mother sobbing, my father yelling. The supervising agent turned to me when the door finally closed. "Are you all right, Captain?" I inhaled deeply. The air tasted sharp, clean, honest. For the first time all day, I could breathe. "Yes, sir, I'm all right." Because in that room in front of officers who understood truth better than my family ever had, I finally stopped being the villain in their story and became the witness to theirs. The ceremony should have felt like the proudest moment of my career, but instead, the atmosphere crackled with unease the moment I stepped onto the parade field. Rows of white folding chairs lined the grass. Families murmured. Children fidgeted. Marines stood in precise formation beneath the California sun that painted everything in a sharp, unforgiving light. But the warmth did nothing to thaw the tension hanging in the air. People whispered when they saw me. Some looked away quickly as if ashamed to meet my eyes. Others stared openly, curiosity mixing with suspicion. News had traveled faster than truth always does. The ceremony had not been canceled despite the investigation. The command wanted to proceed while CID finalized the formal charges. They told me it was my call whether I walked across the stage. I chose to stand there because hiding would have meant surrendering a space I had earned. Still, every step felt like walking into a courtroom instead of a celebration. My dress blues were perfectly pressed, but my hands trembled slightly from everything that had happened. My parents were seated in the second row center exactly where they insisted on being. My mother's face was blotchy from crying. My father sat stiff and furious, jaw clamped so tight I could see the muscles jump. The seat next to them was empty. Amber's seat. She wasn't there because she was still in CID custody, but her absence did nothing to ease the speculation rippling across the crowd. A few Marines approached me with quiet nods of support. A couple of officers shook my hand with polite neutrality. No one knew what to believe yet, and that hurt more than I expected. Colonel Hayes stepped up to the podium. He was the kind of Marine whose voice could slice through a storm, but even he couldn't cut through the awkward silence entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are here to honor extraordinary service today." His voice carried across the field, but it lacked the usual celebratory cadence. He was stalling, buying time, waiting for CID to confirm whether they had the green light. The ceremony felt like it was balanced on a thin wire stretched tight between truth and chaos. Then the side gate opened. A single CID agent stepped through with a folder under his arm. His uniform looked slightly rumpled like he had run across the entire base. Everyone saw him. The whispered murmurs swelled. People craned their necks. Colonel Hayes stepped back from the podium instinctively as the agent approached the stage stairs. My parents stiffened. My father muttered something under his breath. My mother clutched the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. The CID agent climbed the steps. His boots echoed sharply against the metal platform. When he reached the top, he leaned toward Colonel Hayes and whispered something. The colonel's expression hardened immediately. The agent handed him a folder thick with paperwork. Evidence. Statements. Camera stills. The final confirmation CID had been working toward all day. Colonel Hayes opened the folder just enough to glance inside. Then he stepped back to the microphone. The microphone was still on. Every word that followed carried through the speakers with flawless clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, a brief but urgent update from CID has just been delivered." The field went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Colonel Hayes continued. "The device discovered prior to today's ceremony was not an accident. The device was planted by Amber Maddox." A stunned, gasping silence rolled across the crowd like a shockwave. It wasn't scattered or confused. It was unified. One sharp breath drawn by hundreds of people all at once. I stood motionless, my spine locked, my lungs frozen. I didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. I felt hollow, like my body needed time to catch up to the truth the world had finally been forced to see. In the second row, my mother slapped a hand over her mouth. My father surged to his feet, outraged. "She's lying! Riley staged this. She always spins things to make herself look good. She's manipulating you." Some people turned to look at him with confusion. others with disgust. Colonel Hayes didn't flinch. "Sir, the evidence is overwhelming. Please step back." Mark Maddox shook with fury. He pointed at me, shouting accusations fueled by years of unchecked entitlement. I felt every pair of eyes swing toward me again, but this time the confusion was fading, replaced with something steadier, something closer to belief. Behind the crowd near the walkway leading to the field, 2 MPs appeared, escorting Amber in restraints. Her wrists were secured in front of her. She looked drained and terrified, not the confident girl who had bragged about ruining my ceremony. The moment people saw her, the whispers exploded again, but this time they were full of certainty, full of recognition, full of anger. Amber's voice wavered. "Mom, Dad, please. I didn't mean to. It was just a joke." My mother stumbled out of her chair, sobbing as if she were the victim. My father tried to charge toward the MPs, but 2 Marines intercepted him with calm, practiced efficiency. Colonel Hayes raised his voice. "This ceremony will proceed. Captain Maddox has honored this country with exceptional courage and leadership. That courage includes standing here today." His words weren't shouted, but they had weight, the kind of weight that silences chaos without effort. The MPs began leading Amber away. She twisted back toward me, her eyes wide, her voice cracking. "Riley, please help me. Please. You know I didn't mean it. You know I wouldn't hurt you." Her words reached me, but not the way she intended. They passed straight through me like air, carrying no weight, no truth, no relevance. This was not the little sister I failed. This was the woman who made a choice that nearly cost me everything. And now the consequences she had tried to dodge were rolling over her with the full force of reality. The full field watched her go. It was not a courtroom. It was not a private moment. It was public exposure in the harshest form. The truth stripped of every disguise walking on display across a Marine Corps parade field. People shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had doubted the wrong person. Officers who had looked at me strangely earlier now straightened their posture. Marines who had whispered stepped back into rigid, attentive silence. Even the colonel studied me with new gravity. My father was still shouting, being pulled back by 2 Marines, while my mother sobbed into her hands. The MP escort paused long enough for a CID agent to step beside the colonel and announce into the mic. Evidence collected includes recorded confession and security footage showing Miss Maddox placing the device. The gasps strengthened. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered to each other with anger simmering beneath their words. A woman near the front muttered. She tried to sabotage her own sister's ceremony. "Unbelievable," a Marine beside her said softly. "Captain Maddox deserved better than that." The ceremony hung suspended for another breath. Then Colonel Hayes squared his shoulders and addressed the field with solemn authority. "We will now continue with the honoring of Captain Riley Maddox. Please rise." Hundreds of people stood, not because of routine protocol, but because the truth had been spoken in front of them all. The moment that followed felt like the closing of a long wound. Not healed, not forgiven, but finally exposed to light after being buried under years of gaslighting, blame, shifting, and denial. And as Amber disappeared behind the wall of uniforms and my father's shouting faded against the wind, I felt the first quiet flicker of something I had not felt in years. Relief. For a long moment after Amber disappeared behind the rows of Marines and the field settled into a stunned, uneasy silence, I wasn't sure I could make my legs move. My knees trembled in a way they never had on deployment under incoming fire. My breath came shallow, tight in my chest, as if my body didn't quite understand what had just happened or what was about to happen next. The ceremony staff waited. The Marines in formation waited. The colonel stood steady at the podium, giving me time, but not too much, as if he sensed that the next step would mark something monumental in my life, a line drawn in public view, permanent and irreversible. When he finally turned toward me and nodded, everything around me stilled. "Captain Maddox, please step forward." My boots felt heavier than they ever had. Every step toward the stage vibrated through my bones. Not because I doubted my worth, but because I had spent so many years being told directly and indirectly that nothing I did mattered the way Amber's did, that my achievements were somehow less real than hers, that my service was something to be politely ignored. Now, hundreds of people were watching me walk toward a podium where my truth had just been broadcast across a military field through a live microphone. My hands trembled as I reached the wooden steps. I curled my fingers slightly so people wouldn't see them shake. When I reached the platform, Colonel Hayes met my eyes with the expression of a man who understood the weight of what I had endured even before the world saw it. His voice carried softly but clearly into the microphone. Courage isn't always on the battlefield. Sometimes it's standing alone. A wave of emotion rolled through the crowd. I felt it physically like a warm current cutting through the cold shock that had been gripping the field moments before. Some Marines in the formation straightened noticeably as if his words hit them on a personal level. Parents in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others looked at me with something close to awe. I stood at attention. It felt surreal to stand tall after the humiliation, the accusations, the betrayal that had almost crushed me just hours earlier. Colonel Hayes lifted the velvet case containing the Medal of Valor. His voice steadied as he continued reading from the citation. For extraordinary courage under fire, decisive leadership under catastrophic threat, and selfless action resulting in the rescue of 5 Marines following an explosive ambush in Iraq, Captain Riley Maddox is awarded the Medal of Valor. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, not from nerves, from memory. The overturned MRAP, the smoke, the screams, the dust settling while my ears rang, the overwhelming heat crawling over my skin, the weight of a fallen Marine slung over my shoulder. The clarity I'd felt in those moments: move fast, think faster, save who you can. I hadn't expected recognition. I definitely hadn't expected to be celebrated, and I certainly hadn't expected to receive the medal on a day when my own family had nearly destroyed the ceremony itself. Colonel Hayes lifted the ribbon. I bowed my head slightly, and he placed it carefully around my neck. His hands were steady. Mine weren't. When I rose again, the applause began slowly, almost cautiously, like people weren't sure if they should clap yet. Then, something remarkable happened. One Marine in the front row stood, then another, then a third. Within seconds, every Marine on the field rose in unison. The sound of hundreds of boots hitting the grass echoed like a single, thunderous heartbeat. Then the applause swelled raw, loud, undeniable. It rolled across the field with a force so strong it made my eyes sting. These were not polite claps. These were not hesitant gestures born out of obligation. They were for me, for what I had done, for what I had survived, for the truth that had finally been dragged into the light. I tried to breathe against the tightening in my throat, but emotion pressed hard against my lungs. I blinked quickly to maintain composure, but one tear managed to escape. I let it. I stood straighter. For the first time since joining the Marine Corps 11 years ago, I felt seen not just for my rank or my job, but for my strength, for who I was beneath the uniform, for the battles I fought off the battlefield too. Off to the left of the stage, my parents remained seated. They didn't clap. They didn't stand. They didn't smile. My mother stared straight ahead, face blank, with something between shock and defensive denial. My father looked furious, arms crossed so tightly his shoulders shook. They had spent years insisting that my career was just a performance. That service wasn't a real accomplishment, that Amber was the golden child and I was the emotional one. Now the entire field had witnessed the truth they'd fought tooth and nail to hide. They had been wrong. Terribly, undeniably wrong. And the world finally knew it. The applause went on longer than any applause I'd ever heard at any ceremony. Marines rarely applaud unless something profound has happened. Today apparently counted. When the sound finally eased, Colonel Hayes stepped closer and lowered his voice so only I could hear. "You earned this long before today. Hold your head high." I nodded, unable to force words through the emotion clogging my throat. He turned back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Maddox has shown exceptional valor in service to this country. Let this moment stand as a reminder that character outlasts circumstance." Once again, the crowd erupted into applause. My hands still trembled, but not from fear now, from something like relief, something like vindication. Something like reclaiming my own story after a lifetime of being cast as the dramatic one, the unstable one, the problem. Today, I stood alone, and it was enough. As I stepped back from the podium, Marines nodded at me as I passed. A female corporal whispered respectfully, "Ma'am, congratulations." A staff sergeant touched his fist lightly to his chest in a silent gesture of honor. For every ounce of pain my family had caused me, these moments felt like stitching pulled through a wound to help it finally close. When I glanced once more in my parents' direction, they quickly looked away, pretending to be busy adjusting their jackets. But their refusal to acknowledge the ceremony no longer hurt, not the way it once would have, because the applause still echoed. The medal still rested against my chest, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged on the stage more than they ever belonged in the audience. This was the moment of honor, mine, and nothing they did could take it away. 1 week after the ceremony, after the truth had exploded into the open, and after Amber had been taken away in cuffs under the afternoon sun, I expected silence. I expected distance. I expected the kind of emptiness that follows a storm when everyone finally retreats to lick their wounds in private. But toxic families never stay quiet for long. They regroup, they rewrite. They reach back out not because they have changed, but because they still believe they can pull you back into their orbit. The audacity always returns. Mine arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was in my office at Camp Pendleton reviewing training notes for an upcoming EOD lecture when my phone lit up with a familiar number. My mother. I stared at the screen for several rings, unsure whether to answer or let it fade into voicemail. But some part of me needed to hear what new version of reality she had crafted for herself. I answered. My mother's voice came through trembling, breathy, full of dramatics she insisted she never had. "Riley, honey, we need to talk." I said nothing. Silence is a language every gaslighter hates. She rushed to fill it. "I know things got out of hand last week. I know everyone was emotional. I know you're upset." Upset. I nearly laughed. Upset was when someone forgot your birthday. Upset was when a coworker took your parking space. Upset was not the correct word for nearly being harmed at your own Medal of Valor ceremony. Upset did not describe discovering your sister placed a device under your seat. And upset did not cover the shock of your parents insisting you staged it to get attention. But she continued, "Your sister is in a very difficult situation and we need your help." The phrasing "we need your help" was deliberate. She never asked what I needed, never asked how I felt, never asked if I was even breathing normally after the trauma they chose to minimize. My mother inhaled sharply as if bracing herself for my reaction. "The investigation is moving so fast, they're saying she could face serious consequences. You know how fragile she is. You know she didn't mean to hurt anyone. She made a mistake." A mistake. The word rattled something inside me. A mistake was dropping a glass or forgetting an appointment. A mistake was sending the wrong email or burning dinner. A mistake was not constructing an improvised device and sliding it under your sister's chair at a restricted military event. My mother kept going before I could respond. "If you talk to the investigators, you can calm things down. Explain that she didn't intend anything serious. They listen to you. You have influence. You can soften this." That was when I finally spoke. My voice came out quieter than I expected, but sharper too. "Influence. You ignored my influence when I begged you for years to take me seriously. You ignored my influence when I told you Amber needed boundaries. You ignored my influence when she jeopardized my ceremony." My mother's tone tightened. "Riley, please do not make this harder than it already is. Your sister is suffering. She needs support. She needs family." The word family cracked something open. My mother kept talking, her voice rising with indignation. "You cannot turn your back on her now. She is your sister. Blood is blood. Families stick together." That last sentence came from behind her deeper, angrier masculine. My father. He had picked up the phone extension. Of course he did. He never let my mother handle conflict alone unless it benefited him. His voice thundered into my ear a second later. "Families stick together. This is your chance to show some loyalty. You're being selfish and dramatic like always. You've humiliated us enough. Help your sister fix this." The words selfish and dramatic were so predictable they barely stung. They were the same labels they used every time I tried to advocate for myself since I was 12 years old. My father kept going. "You don't want Amber in prison. You don't want this tearing the family apart. Fix this before it ruins us." Ruins us. Not ruins me. Not ruins my life. Not ruins my career. Not ruins my safety. The only thing on his mind was reputation. Optics, appearance, the image of the Maddox family. My breath steadied as the clarity hit me. They still believed I was responsible for managing the consequences of their behavior. They still believed they could guilt me into compliance. They still believed that loyalty meant self-destruction. Before I answered, I could hear my mother whispering into the receiver, soft, desperate words meant to manipulate. "We know you don't want to do this, but you're her only hope. You're the only one she has." I closed my eyes, let the silence build, and when I finally spoke, my voice was cold. A kind of cold that comes only after fire has burned too long. Family doesn't place devices under my seat. The silence on the other end went dead still. My mother inhaled sharply as if I had slapped her. My father growled something incoherent, the sound thick with rage. I didn't let them speak again. I continued. "Family doesn't mock my service. Family doesn't call me dramatic when I nearly die. Family doesn't lie to federal agents. Family doesn't sabotage the biggest moment of my career." My voice sharpened further. "Family doesn't beg for help only when the consequences hit them. You lost the right to ask anything of me." My mother tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. "I'm done, completely done." Then I ended the call. No soft goodbye, no reassurance, no crack in my tone. Just an ending, a clean cut, a severing of a lifelong rope I had dragged behind me like a weight. I sat there for several minutes after hanging up, feeling the tremor of adrenaline working its way out of my hands. But beneath the trembling, something steadier was growing, rising, building like the first strong breath after breaking the surface of cold water. Peace, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but peace, born from finality. Over the next 48 hours, they attempted to call 14 more times. I blocked both numbers. My father sent an email accusing me of being heartless. My mother sent one begging me to reconsider. I deleted both without reading past the first line. Then something unexpected happened. CID emailed me confirming that due to my family's continued interference and attempts to contact investigators, they had been restricted from entering the base or attempting to reach me during the legal process. In other words, they were cut off, completely. Their access to me was gone because of their own choices. And instead of feeling guilt or conflict or the crushing weight of responsibility I had been conditioned to carry, I felt light, weightless, free in a way I had never experienced with them in my life. Their audacity had tried to return, but for the first time in my life, I didn't let it in the door. I closed it, locked it, and walked away without looking back. Consequences do not arrive like thunder. They seep in slowly at first, then gather weight and shape until they become impossible to outrun. 1 week after I cut off all contact, the aftermath of Amber's actions and my parents' choices began to unfold with a force none of them had prepared for. The Marine Corps and federal investigators moved quietly but decisively. By the second week, Amber Maddox was officially charged with possession of an explosive device, bringing a prohibited device onto a military installation, attempted harm, and reckless endangerment of military personnel. The phrasing "attempted harm" made me shiver even though I already knew the truth. Hearing it written formally in a legal document stripped away any possibility of her actions being twisted into a joke, a misunderstanding, or the melodramatic overreaction my parents always accused me of. It was real. It was documented. It carried years of potential penalties. When the charges became public record, the shockwave hit Boise, Idaho before it finished rippling through Camp Pendleton. My parents lived on a quiet street where neighbors pretended to mind their own business, but in reality paid close attention to everything. The news spread fast, not because people were nosy, but because word like this could not be contained. A daughter arrested on federal charges at a military base. A bomb at a ceremony. The kind of headline that turned a suburban block into a rumor mill. It didn't take long before the neighbor who used to wave politely at my father while watering his lawn stopped waving. The woman who always complimented my mother's garden refused to make eye contact. People stopped dropping by. Cars slowed when passing the Maddox house. Hushed conversations took place on driveways. Children whispered on sidewalks. The Maddox family went from an average suburban household to a cautionary tale in less than a week. And then the investigation extended outward. My parents had interfered with CID investigators during and after the inquiry. They had attempted to downplay evidence, invalidate statements, and even contact personnel to ask them to reconsider their findings. Obstruction. That was the word used, a word they never imagined would be attached to their names. The day federal agents came to interview them again, several neighbors saw the unmarked vehicles outside their home. My mother later left me one last message before I blocked the number entirely, her voice frantic. "Riley, what is happening? They are accusing us of things we did not do. You need to tell them we were confused, that we were emotional, that we didn't mean anything harmful, that we were just trying to protect our daughter." Protect. That word tasted bitter. They had not protected anyone. Not me, not Amber, not themselves. They protected their denial, their pride, their need to control the narrative no matter how delusional it became. When I did not respond, she sent an email. Then another. Then another. Eventually, she stopped. Because consequences were the only language she couldn't manipulate. My father reacted differently. He grew angrier. He shouted at investigators. He pointed fingers at everyone except the people responsible. He even tried to claim the entire situation was a military conspiracy to embarrass him personally. His voice carried through the neighborhood so loudly one neighbor recorded the rant. It circulated among the block within hours. The Maddox name became poisoned by their own behavior. Despite their attempts to spin the story, no one believed their excuses anymore. Not after the audio recording surfaced. Not after the camera footage. Not after Amber's messages to her friends became public in the official report. For the first time in their lives, they were forced to face a truth without being able to bend it. Meanwhile, I took the steps I had postponed for far too long. I moved. My on-base housing had always been temporary, but now it felt suffocating. Too many memories of that day. Too many looks of pity from people who meant well but reminded me of everything I wanted to leave behind. I filed a request to transfer to a different housing unit. A small, quiet place near San Clemente, close enough to Pendleton to keep my routines intact, but far enough to give my mind room to breathe. Moving into that apartment felt like shedding a heavy coat I had worn for years without realizing its weight. I unpacked slowly, methodically, careful with every item. The metal went in a small wooden box not displayed on the wall yet. Not because I was ashamed, but because I needed space to feel like myself outside of that ceremony, outside of the trauma attached to it, outside of my family's shadow. For the first time in a long time, I felt the early tremors of healing. Not dramatic, not sudden, quiet, subtle, like breath returning to a tired body. I visited the base less on my off days. I walked along the beach more often. I kept my phone on, do not disturb. I slept, real sleep. Not the fractured kind that broke every hour with nightmares or the imagined sound of a pressure trigger clicking beneath my seat. But trauma is not a straight line. It loops, it dips, it surprises you. There were days I woke up feeling guilty for cutting my family off, even though logic told me I had done the only safe thing. There were nights I found myself replaying Amber's voice in the recording, her laughter slicing through the audio like a blade. There were moments when I imagined my parents' house with the blinds drawn while they sat inside, surrounded by the consequences they had tried desperately to escape. Healing isn't supposed to be kind at first. It is an unraveling before it becomes repair. One morning, while drinking coffee on my small balcony, I noticed something had shifted inside me. A quiet knowing. A small sense of calm I didn't recognize at first. The absence of dread. The absence of expecting someone to call and demand explanations. The absence of being responsible for everyone else's comfort. For once, the silence in my life wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Later that week, CID updated me on Amber's case. She had been assigned a public defender after refusing to answer certain questions without legal counsel. She had broken down repeatedly during interviews, alternating between blaming me, blaming stress, blaming the military, and claiming she never meant to hurt anyone. The contradictions didn't help her. My parents' obstruction wasn't being ignored either. They were not being charged, but they were officially reprimanded and warned, and their access to the base remained restricted permanently. They could no longer show up unannounced. They could no longer attempt to reach me. They could no longer insert themselves into my career or my safety. That alone brought a level of relief I had never experienced growing up. In Boise, neighbors now crossed the street to avoid my parents. A few longtime friends stopped returning their calls. The church they attended asked for clarification about the investigation after members expressed concern. The Maddox name was no longer associated with perfect holiday cards or neighborhood potlucks. It was associated with explosive device investigations, federal agents, and public humiliation. And none of it was my doing. It was the first time they were forced to live in a reality shaped by their own behaviors rather than the illusions they used to control others. As for me, my life began expanding in ways I hadn't realized were possible. My evenings grew calmer. My thoughts grew quieter. The air felt lighter around me. I spoke to my therapist at the VA center twice a week. She told me healing would come in waves, some gentle, some fierce, but all necessary. She told me I was grieving not the loss of my family, but the loss of the fantasy that they could ever be the family I needed. She said it was normal, healthy even. And for the first time, I believed her. I believed there was a life waiting for me beyond the chaos I had been raised in. A life built on truth, not gaslighting. Boundaries, not guilt. Respect, not manipulation. I believed I deserved that life, and I was finally beginning to step into it. This was not the end of the consequences. Not yet. But it was the beginning of mine. The beginning of choosing myself. The beginning of my emotional healing. The beginning of becoming whole. The aftermath did not roar. It did not blaze. It arrived quietly like a tide creeping over sand while no one is watching, swallowing whole the noise that had dominated my life for so long. After the chaos, after the charges, after the Maddox name became something whispered in hallways and discussed in CID offices, the world around me finally slowed down enough for my mind to catch up. And that was when the real work began. Healing. That word used to annoy me. It sounded soft, fragile, too delicate for someone who spent more than a decade cutting wires in dusty roads under relentless sun, praying my hands stayed steady. But healing is not soft. It is not fragile. It is demanding. It requires the same discipline as stepping into a blast zone, the same courage as returning fire under pressure, the same steadiness as diffusing a trigger assembly by feel alone. I learned this on my first day at the VA center. I didn't want to go. My commanding officer insisted. He said trauma sometimes hides behind routine discipline, and Marines are the worst at acknowledging the wounds no one can see. He booked the appointment himself. When I walked into the VA building in Oceanside, I felt strangely out of place. Not because I didn't belong, but because belonging meant admitting something had broken inside me. The lobby was quiet. The air conditioning hummed. A few veterans sat spaced out each, carrying their own universe of scars. A receptionist pointed me toward a room with soft lighting and walls painted in muted blues. My therapist introduced herself with a calm smile that did not feel forced. She asked one question to start. "Captain Maddox, why are you here today?" It was such a simple question, yet my throat tightened as if she had asked me to relive every explosion, every betrayal, every quiet moment of doubt all at once. I answered with the truth that surprised even me, because I survived something my own family created, and I don't know what to do with that. She nodded slowly, as if she had expected it. Our sessions became the anchor points of my week. Sometimes I talked, sometimes I couldn't. Some sessions felt like lifting boulders off my chest. Others felt like placing new ones there. But she never pushed too fast. She never judged. She helped me understand something I had never grasped. That healing was not about forgiving my family. It was about forgiving myself for believing their lies for so many years. about releasing the guilt they had pressed into my bones since childhood, about letting myself exist without their voices in my head telling me I was too dramatic, too emotional, too much. One afternoon after a session, I sat in my car with the engine off and stared out the windshield at the parking lot. The sky above was washed with a pale golden tint, a softness that settled into my chest as I realized something quietly significant. I had not thought about my parents all day, not once, not with guilt, not with fear, not with panic. Just absence. Peaceful absence. That discovery felt like a new beginning. A week later, I received a knock on my apartment door. When I opened it, 3 Marines from my former unit stood outside. Staff Sergeant Pierce, the same man who had sent me the voicemail that started unraveling the truth, was at the front. He gave me a small grin. "Heard you were hiding from the world, so we figured we'd drag you out." I almost laughed. Almost. I stepped aside and let them in. For hours, they sat in my living room, swapping stories, teasing each other, filling the silence with the warmth of familiarity I didn't know I had missed so much. They asked how I was doing. I told them the truth for the first time in a long time. I'm getting better. Slowly. They didn't offer empty comforts. Marines never do. Instead, they reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my worth had never been tied to my family's inability to see it, that the Corps had seen me long before a medal hung around my neck. Their visit filled a space that had been hollow for weeks, a space my family used to occupy. Except this time, the space wasn't filled with guilt or shame or tension. It was filled with camaraderie, respect, care. Days passed quietly after that. Then weeks. My routines returned. My breathing evened. I found myself standing a little straighter, sleeping a little deeper, smiling more often even when no one was watching. And then, one morning, an email arrived. Subject line: instruction opportunity at Quantico. I blinked at it for several seconds before opening it. The offer came from the Marine Corps Training and Education Command. They wanted me to guest teach advanced EOD courses at Quantico, temporarily at first, then potentially full-time. The words felt unreal. Teaching at Quantico meant being trusted at one of the highest levels of training. It meant shaping the next generation of EOD officers. It meant stepping into a role built from knowledge earned through pain, perseverance, and fire. It meant my career was no longer in question. It was rising. I read the message 3 times, then a 4th, then sat back in my chair as a slow, steady pride expanded through me. Not the sharp pride from the ceremony, a deeper one, a quiet one, the kind built from knowing you survived what was meant to break you. I forwarded the email to my CO. His response came minutes later. "Maddox, you deserve this. Say yes." So I did. Teaching at Quantico became a future I could reach, for a future rooted in my own choosing, not in the shadow of my family's expectations or their condemnation. And that was when the final shift happened inside me. The shift from surviving to living, from enduring to building, from running to standing still without fear. Forgiveness was the hardest part. People believe forgiveness is an act you give to others. I learned it is something you give yourself. I forgave myself for staying too long, for trying too hard, for believing them, for loving them even when it hurt, for not seeing sooner that their love was conditional and their acceptance was a trap. But I did not forgive them. I didn't have to. And my therapist repeated that truth every time guilt tried to sneak back in. You can heal without forgiving the people who wounded you. Distance is not cruelty. Distance is protection. That sentence became a lifeline. I repeated it on the days I felt doubt, on the days the memories resurfaced, on the days when traces of old wounds pulsed beneath the surface. And gradually, the guilt faded, the anger softened, the grief settled into something manageable. I was learning to live a life that did not orbit around their chaos. I was learning to live a life where I existed on purpose, not in reaction to their destruction. One evening, I stood on the beach near San Clemente. The sky was a swirl of gold and blue. Waves rolled in with a rhythm that felt steady enough to match my breath. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Not because everything was solved, not because justice was complete, not because the pain was gone, but because I finally knew the difference between being alone and being free. I whispered the truth into the wind like a vow. I choose myself now. And that was how the quiet aftermath began, not with the absence of pain, but with the presence of peace. The final reckoning did not arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful reunion. It came quietly, the same way storms end, not with thunder, but with the slow release of pressure in the air. Months had passed since the ceremony, months in which I had begun rebuilding the pieces of my life, without the weight of expectation or manipulation pressing against my lungs. My days had taken on a rhythm teaching at Quantico, training Marines, shaping young EOD officers who would one day carry the responsibility I once held alone on the battlefield. My evenings were spent walking the beach near San Clemente, grounding myself in the steady pulse of the ocean. It was in this new life that the first letter arrived, a simple white envelope with my name handwritten on the front in uneven blue ink. Amber. The handwriting I had recognized since childhood, though now it looked shakier, as if her hand trembled while writing it. I stood in my kitchen holding the envelope for several seconds, feeling the faint texture of the paper beneath my fingertips. I already knew what it contained. A plea, an apology, a request for forgiveness she had not earned. When I finally opened it, the letter inside was long filled with sentences that stumbled between regret and rationalization. She wrote about the pressure she felt, the jealousy she carried, the resentment she never learned to manage. She wrote that she never intended to hurt me. She wrote that she felt abandoned by me after everything happened. She wrote that she hoped I could understand. The word understand hit me harder than anything else. Understand was the word my family had used all my life to excuse their behavior. Understand your sister was always more sensitive. Understand your father struggles to manage his temper. Understand your mother doesn't mean to hurt your feelings. Understand, understand, understand. Every version of that word had been used to silence me, to dismiss me, to force me to accept mistreatment under the disguise of compassion. But the letter never acknowledged the danger she had put me in, never acknowledged the humiliation she caused, never acknowledged the damage she allowed our parents to inflict on me for years, never acknowledged the trauma I was still working through. She apologized for the consequences she faced, not for the harm she caused. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope without writing a response. I did not feel anger. I did not feel vindication. I felt distance, clean distance. Some wounds do not close with time. Some wounds close only when you walk away from the people who keep ripping them open. A week later, the second envelope arrived, this time from my mother. Her handwriting was neater, tighter, almost desperate in its precision. Inside, she wrote about the state of the family, about the strain, about the shame, about how neighbors whispered and friends stopped calling. She wrote that Mark had become furious, unpredictable, impossible to live with. She wrote that they had sold the house where my childhood had unfolded with all its fractures and unspoken hurts. She wrote that they were separating. She wrote that none of this would have happened if things had not spiraled the way they did. If the military had been more understanding, if the investigators had been more lenient, if I had helped, if. The blame shifted from sentence to sentence like a restless shadow searching for somewhere to land. But never once did it land where it belonged. She never wrote the words we were wrong. She never wrote the words we hurt you. She never wrote the words we should have protected you. Instead, she asked if I could call, if I could visit, if we could start again, as if nothing had happened, as if I could erase the decades of gaslighting, the years of dismissal, the trauma of standing alone on a parade field while my parents screamed that I staged my own near-death experience, as if healing meant returning to the people who caused the wounds. I read her letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with Amber's. I did not write back. That silence was not cruelty. It was a boundary, a line I had drawn with years of unspoken pain behind me, a line they could no longer cross. Over the next month, I learned through public records and through a former neighbor that the Maddox home sold below market value, that my father had moved into a rental across town, that my mother stayed temporarily with a friend from church before renting a one-bedroom apartment, that they blamed each other, that each told a different version of the story to anyone who still listened, that eventually fewer and fewer people wanted to listen at all. And I realized something with startling clarity. Their collapse did not bring me satisfaction. Not anger, not grief, not revenge. Just truth. They were left with the reality they had built with their own hands. A life shaped by denial, resentment, and refusal to change. A life in which consequences finally came home. Meanwhile, I built something entirely different. My days at Quantico were filled with young officers learning the same lessons I learned in combat, but with the chance to teach them without the cruelty I experienced growing up. I watched them gain confidence. I watched them learn to trust their instincts. I watched them step into the weight of responsibility with pride and humility. And it reminded me of who I had fought to become, who I had fought to reclaim, who I had fought to protect when my own family tried to tear her down. Then came the morning of the final reckoning. It wasn't planned. It wasn't symbolic. It was simply a day when something inside me felt ready. I drove to Camp Pendleton just after sunrise. The air was cold enough to sting the back of my throat, the way early coastal mornings often do. I parked near the bluff overlooking the ocean where the cliffs dipped into rolling waves. The beach was empty except for a few Marines conducting their morning run farther down the shoreline. I walked to the edge of the bluff, the metal against my chest catching the faint morning light. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, the horizon soft, the water shifting in slow, rhythmic pulses. I breathed in deep. The past few months had carved both scars and strength into me, had broken me open and rebuilt me piece by piece, had forced me to let go not of people but of illusions, had shown me what love was not, and what self-respect truly was. I closed my eyes and let the wind lift the ends of my hair. Then I whispered into the quiet air the truth I had earned through fire, through betrayal, through resilience. Peace is choosing who you allow into your life. The wind carried the words away toward the waves where they dissolved into the endless blue. I did not turn back to see who was watching. I did not need anyone to validate the moment. I did not need forgiveness from people who never sought to understand me. I did not need closure from those who refused to hold themselves accountable. I had myself, whole, steady, free, and that was the final reckoning. Has anyone ever called you dramatic while you were fighting for your life? It is a strange kind of wound, the kind that does not bleed on the surface, but slices deep beneath the skin where no one else can see. It changes the way you breathe, the way you speak, the way you move through the world. Because once someone who is supposed to love you calls you dramatic at the very moment you are holding yourself together in the middle of disaster, there is a part of you that never forgets it. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you have carried it for years without even realizing the heaviness in your chest had a name. Maybe your pain was dismissed. Maybe your truth was twisted. Maybe your voice was silenced not with violence, but with a smile, a sigh, a sentence meant to shut you up rather than lift you up. Maybe you were told to calm down when your world was burning. Maybe you were told to get over it when someone else caused the damage. Maybe you were told that your fear was overreacting, your sadness was attention-seeking, your anger was ungratefulness. And maybe you stayed quiet because that was the only way to keep the peace. Maybe you learned to carry your own weight alone because no one else ever stepped in to help. Maybe the people who should have protected you ended up protecting the person who hurt you. And maybe, like me, you learned the hard truth that some families do not operate on love. They operate on control, on shame, on silence, on whatever narrative keeps them comfortable, even if it destroys you. But here is something I wish someone had told me years ago. You are not dramatic for recognizing danger. You are not dramatic for calling out cruelty. You are not dramatic for refusing to pretend your suffering is small just because someone else wants the story to be easier. You are not dramatic for surviving, and you are not dramatic for finally choosing yourself. So now I want to ask you, if your own family tried to silence you, tried to rewrite your truth, tried to make you the villain in your own story, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Would you have walked away? Would you have fought back? Would you have demanded your voice be heard, or would you have let them shrink you until you barely recognized yourself? Because here is the part many people will not say out loud: family can be the origin of the deepest wounds. The words spoken at a dinner table can cut sharper than any blade. The betrayal that happens inside a house can echo louder than explosions on a battlefield. And the pain delivered by the people who claim they love you can change the course of your life more than any enemy ever could. When I stood on that parade field with a medal resting against my chest and hundreds of Marines rising to their feet, I realized something with a clarity that felt like a sunrise breaking through fog. Blood is not what makes someone your family. Loyalty is. Safety is. Respect is. Truth is. And you have the right to decide which people get space in your life. You have the right to build boundaries as strong as armor. You have the right to walk away from those who choose to harm you. You have the right to heal without apologizing for protecting yourself. You have the right to build a life that is peaceful, even if the people who raised you never were. Maybe you are listening to this from another country, another state, another quiet room where you have carried your own battles silently. Maybe your story is different from mine, but the feeling is familiar. Maybe you served. Maybe you lost someone. Maybe you endured things at home that no one ever believed. Maybe you stood up for yourself and someone called you dramatic instead of brave. If any part of this story reminded you of your own life, then I want you to know something important. Your truth matters. Your survival matters. Your voice matters. And the moment you decide to step out of the shadow someone else forced you into is the moment your life begins again. Sometimes strength is not diffusing a device or running into danger. Sometimes strength is saying no to the people who taught you to stay quiet. Sometimes strength is walking away from the ones who never clapped for you. Sometimes strength is choosing peace, even if peace means being alone for a little while. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me if anyone has ever dismissed your pain, your voice, your fear, your experience. Tell me what you would have done if someone in your own family tried to silence you. Tell me the truth you wish you could have said years ago. Your story matters here. Your voice matters here. And maybe by sharing it, you will understand something I learned the hard way. You are not alone. You are not dramatic. You are not the problem. You are someone who fought through something you never deserved, and you are still standing. So tell me where you are watching from, and tell me what you would have done if your own family tried to silence you, because your voice deserves to be heard now.